Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the Mining Podcast. And today's guest is Gavin Ferrar, who's the CFO of Central Asia Metals, who are a copper producer with operations in Kazakhstan, and they also have a zinc-led operation in Northern Macedonia. Gavin has a geology and finance background. So it'd be good to get his take on the industry, having worked in South Africa and the UK, and obviously now has a focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So that's welcome, Gavin, to the podcast. How you doing, Gavin?
Very well, thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
No, and I appreciate your time. Before I get into this and asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, just want to remind everyone that's obviously listening to the podcast, appreciate you sharing these the podcast and these episodes out to your friends and family, and anyone else in the industry that you feel would benefit from listening to this podcast. And also the people who are watching this on our YouTube channel, appreciate if you can share this episode again amongst people that you know that you feel that this could benefit. And also if you can like below, click on the like button. That helps us obviously get more engagement, and more people can access this podcast and this YouTube video as well. So appreciate all your shares and likes, so we can get it out to more people. So back to Gavin. Just wondering if you can give our audience a little bit, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, how you got into mining until sort of present day now.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Look, it's quite a long road when I sort of reflect on my career. It's been sort of long and varied, I guess, which is not a bad thing these days. But I grew up actually in a mining town just east of Johannesburg, and the house overlooked the head frame and the whole track of the sort of cocoa wagons, as we used to call them in those days, taking ore to the plant. So always been familiar with the industry. And I guess growing up in South Africa, I was also fortunate, or very fortunate enough, to have my postgraduate studies sponsored by what was then GenCore, which has morphed through a variety of mergers and acquisitions into what's now BHP Billiton. And they sponsored my studies in geology. Now, I guess I'd always been interested in the sort of science and maths and those sort of subjects at school, and was keen to get into some career that involved those sorts of things. And I picked geology, I suppose, partly because I like the outdoors of, aspect of it, where I'd be running around in khaki shorts and a Land Rover, which I did do a little bit of. And the ability to travel, I've always been fascinated with, going to seeing other parts of the world and other cultures and those sort of things. So those drove somewhat the degree choice. I was always going to be engineering or geology, and I know there's always a dispute and a little bit of sort of combativeness between the two disciplines, but I've never really sort of suffered as a result of that, which is good. So after the studies were completed, actually, I graduated into a bit of a recession, and frankly couldn't find any other work other than with a research program, doing scientific research, which has actually turned out to be an amazing privilege as well, because it involved 3 expeditions to Antarctica, which was pretty good fun for a young man in those days. And when you're not aware of all the hazards and various other things, you do some silly things, but collected some pretty rocks and did a lot of analysis on them. And I was very grateful for that opportunity as well. And was presenting some of the results of my research at a conference when Anglo American tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to come and join them in what was their geophysics department at the time, but primarily looking at remote sensing and a particular range of, they were very specialist, and they were looking at shortwave infrared side of the spectrum and how to use that to prospect for minerals. So again, kind of cutting edge technology. And what it showed me was that the amount of money that mining companies were willing to spend on exploration and technology, and how much further ahead they were than as general academia were in terms of their understanding of a lot of these things, because it was all proprietary. So that was quite fun as well. And then onto the boots on the ground part, I worked for Anglo in Tanzania for about 2 years, greenfields exploration, gold, a little bit of base metals. A couple of the assets that we looked after at the time, as a big team of us, was Gator, which was part of Anglo Gold Ashanti. Now that developed into a mine. Buzwagi developed into a mine for Barrick. And there were a couple of others that are now up in Acacia's portfolio as well. So it was quite a good sort of stomping ground for a young geologist, learning the ropes, running programs, all those sorts of disciplines. And again, that went into a more kind of project development phase with the Yatela project in West Africa, again with Anglo. And towards the end of that, there was a feasibility study that we were running, and it was actually in joint venture with a company called IM Gold, who continually sent investment bankers and analysts out to look at the asset, typical Canadians trying to get their stock price up with news flow and various other things. And I was looking at these bankers turning up and refusing to get out into the 50-degree heat out of the sort of air-conditioned Land Rovers. And core shed was not something they visited, because under a tin roof and that sort of heat, again, was just inhospitable stuff. But by that stage, we'd all got used to it. So I thought to myself, I've been in the bush for sort of 4 or 5 years, getting more and more interested in the financial metrics around how to develop projects, what decisions got made into getting those. So I decided to come to London to study a finance degree. So I think it was, a lot of people go, why geology and finance? It's an odd mix, but not all geologists are numerate. I think most of us are actually very numerate these days, because everything is computer based nowadays, and a lot of the geology I was interested in was there was a bit of maths behind it as well. So getting into the banking world wasn't that much of a leap, because I understood the industry and I had a lot of empathy for the clients, which I think counted quite a bit when I was working with mining clients on financing their projects in the junior end of the spectrum, and then even in the majors, just being able to understand very quickly what companies like Anglo and Xstrata were up to at the time, and looking at their M&A opportunities and how to finance those was a fairly fun part of the career as well. So I think the move from a technical background into banking is quite well trodden now amongst a lot of my colleagues that I was, people at Anglo that I was with are now head of commodities at major investment banks and various other things. So I don't think it's an unusual path to follow, but it certainly raises a few eyebrows every now and then. But
okay. Just a couple of things that you obviously you mentioned. Obviously, work in Antarctica. I wonder if you can just give us a quick snapshot of your experience working in Antarctica. So I think that would be of interest, definitely to me, and hopefully our audience.
Well, like I said, it's very scientific research based. We weren't exploring for minerals or anything like that. So that's the first point I'd make. And I think it's still back then you definitely weren't allowed to do that. And I believe that rule still remains. It was just like boys' own adventure stuff. It was 2-man tent out on the ice for 3 to 4 months at a time. Quite isolated, but we did meet up with other groups every now and then. So, you sit and have a beer. You have to defrost the beer in a black plastic bag every day, so you'd have a cold beer to have when you got back from the field in the evening. And just a lot of autonomy. So you'd have to design the program yourself, execute it yourself, and then produce the research. Not necessarily in isolation. And once you got back to the labs and into the university campuses, you had a lot of knowledge to draw on. But again, I think as a background for anybody who wants to run a business, I think geology really gives you that broad spectrum of, how to plan, how to execute, how to produce results. And that certainly was pretty helpful through the rest of my career. But no, in terms of the experience, it was just utterly fantastic. I was going through some photographs the other day to digitize them. They're still on old 35mm slides. Because my daughter, who's 8 years old, her school asked me to give a talk on it. And the first question that I got asked from an 8-year-old boy was, if you went to Antarctica, how come you're still alive? And I realized they'd been studying Scott's expedition, which obviously didn't end well for those poor guys. But modern days, it's a lot easier. So look, I think it's, as I said earlier, it was an absolute privilege, Rob, to be allowed to get there. There was, I think, a dozen field scientists when I was on the program, and probably 80 people in total every year going down on the South African program. And of course, many other countries had programs as well. And we, liaised and worked with the Germans, the Brits, the Norwegians, even the Russians sometimes. So, and that was back in the sort of 90s. So it was kind of unusual in those days. So it was a very collaborative effort. And I think that was part of what I enjoyed, and still have contacts all over the world from that experience.
Yeah. You're obviously the CFO of Central Asia Metals now. What do you think you've got an advantage being a CFO where you've had a geology background previously? Do you think you're like, if you compare yourself to other CFOs, do you think you've got some advantages because you were a geologist previously, and being out in the field, maybe understanding what the guys are going through, being on site in a mining operation?
From that aspect, absolutely. I think you do have a lot of a greater detailed understanding of the technical sides of the business, and where it translates into the CFO role is often in the budgeting process, where you're going, do you really need that piece of kit, or is that enough meters to be drilling here? And that, development costs and all those sorts of things are part of what I've dealt with, over the last 20 years of my experience. So that certainly does help. I guess not being an accountant has its disadvantages, but I'm very lucky in that I've got a couple of talented accountants that work for me that paper over those deficiencies in my own experience. But I think that is part of management, right? You've got to delegate, you've got to trust people to deliver the things. And my banking career certainly taught me to analyze accounts properly and make sure that they all, added up properly. I guess is an obvious thing to say, but analyzing things, spotting areas that potentially would lead to issues later on is part of the sort of banking / financial analyst mindset as well. So from that aspect, I'm fairly well set up. Ask me about IFRS and I probably know about 3 or 4 rules, right? But and again, you've got to rely on people and hire talented people in order to make sure that you are covered in all those areas. So I wouldn't say compared to other CFOs, I was at a massive advantage, no, because the flip side, I'm at a disadvantage in terms of their accounting and reporting knowledge. Right? But I think overall it balances. Where it does help maybe is having a more strategic outlook. And I think that's more the kind of CFO that you're seeing more and more of. I think you saw it back in sort of early 2000s with companies like Xstrata that had ex-investment bankers rather than chartered accountants as CFOs that were looking to grow a business and really drive forward there. So the CFO aspect of my job is mostly around treasury and balance sheet and how to finance the future of the business, as well as all of the other aspects of the job. But where I can sort of bring a little bit more to it is just understanding that deeper industry understanding and knowledge of different things and different products out there for us to use and effectively run an efficient balance sheet.
Yeah. What would you say the career path is if someone was to follow in your footsteps, i.e. be a geologist, be a mine engineer or any other discipline within the mining industry, but then want to move into more of a financial type role and then potentially become the CFO of a company? Is there a particular career path they sort of go down? Obviously, is there certain qualifications do you feel that they need? Obviously, you've got a finance. You studied a master's in finance, I believe.
I've got an MBA in finance.
MBA.
Yeah. So,
yeah. I mean, and the reason why I'm asking that question, there might be people listening to this podcast that are either engineers, geologists. They could be surveyors. They could be any type of engineering type of mine in the mining industry, but may have their future in a CFO role, for instance. What advice would you give them if they want to go down that particular path?
Well, if we start right at the beginning of people's careers, I mean, what we see a little bit too much of is people who graduate with a mining degree, right? Either engineering or metallurgy or geology, and then immediately want to jump into finance and banking. And what I would encourage people who are thinking of that to do is definitely go out and get 2 to 5 years of experience in the industry. And we're in a cycle now where I think there will be a lot of opportunities for young graduate engineers and geos to get out and really experience what the industry is about, both in terms of development of assets, exploration for new mineralogy, for new mineral deposits, and also executing on sort of construction, project management, and then all the way through into production. And I think if you can get an experience like that in that 5-year window, that really then sets you up to do a whole bunch of different things within the industry, whether it be investment banking like I went into, or getting into consultancy or whatever. It at least gives you that firm footing in the industry and with hard industry experience. And that not only sets you up from a knowledge base wise, but also gives you a lot of credibility. People that are sort of 5 to 10 years into their careers, you must never forget that a lot of the skills that they have are transferable. And I mentioned earlier the numeracy part of it. So all engineers and most geologists now are extremely numerate people. And if you're going to get into finance, clearly that's the foundation of any financial career, is being able to work with numbers. So I would say that those opportunities will always exist, and it's really down to the individual in terms of creating those opportunities. Now, I did it via studying, and then I was tenacious. I mean, I must have applied for over 100 jobs when I finished my MBA. All of them in banking. And I wanted to get into banking because I'd, as I said, had some experience of people who were doing it. It looked like an interesting job where I could use both sort of the new education that I had, plus all the years of experience I'd built up. But also, as a career, I think finance is quite fascinating. I think there are a lot of different aspects to it. There are the equity capital markets, the debt capital markets, there are the financial derivatives. And I got interested basically by reading novels about finance. I think there was one called Barbarians at the Gate, which is about a big M&A that occurred.
I've seen the film. I've seen the film.
And the other one I read was I think called The Smartest Guys in the Room, not because I ever thought I was one, but it was about how financial instruments can unravel. That was around the Enron saga. So it's, if you have an interest in it, then drive yourself to achieving it. And I don't think it's impossible for anybody, because I think nowadays, and the way people are hiring, we are moving much more towards a meritocracy. And I saw that in investment banking, where you had people from all walks of life who had all sorts of different educations, be it classics, English, engineering, whatever. As long as they were smart and they could get their heads around sort of complex, well, maybe not even that complex, but just being logical and numerate at the same time, you'll be all right.
Yeah. What made you sort of join Central Asia Metals? Because obviously you were working on the finance side of the industry. What made you then go back into mining?
It's a good question, Rob, and it's probably one I've never satisfactorily answered for myself. But I got to a point in my banking career, and I'd been doing it for about a dozen years, where I was working more closely at that point with junior mining companies, and both doing equity investing on behalf of the bank and also the debt product as well. And it came back to, I suppose, my technical background, going, okay, well, what these guys are doing is actually hands-on developing something. Maybe I should get into that. And out of the blue, an opportunity arose with it was actually a cash shell company, to go out and locate or find an opportunity and then bring it to the market. And I did that, and it failed, but as everyone says, you learn through failure, and I certainly learned a whole lot. And I got in touch with Nick Clark, who at the time was the CEO of Central Asia Metals, and just said, look, I'm out of work. I'm sort of knocking around. If you ever need a hand doing something, give me a call. And I was fortunate that a couple of old clients of mine knocked on the door, and they said, look, we're doing a capital raise. Can you just help us? We don't have the bandwidth internally to do it. So I sat alongside CFOs and CEOs and helped them with some fundraisings, and helped other sort of private equity funds a little bit with some strategic assistance in terms of how to, where they should be focusing. And that sort of kept the lights on for a while. And then Nick did call me up and said, look, you needed some help. There were only, I think, 4 or 5 people in the head office at the time. And they very successfully developed the Kounrad project in Kazakhstan. And were being shown a lot of opportunities by investment banks, but didn't have anybody with the time effectively to sift through all of these things and rank them and decide on whether or not they should be pursuing any of these opportunities. So that was the first thing I did for Nick, and it was as a consultant. So I spent, I think it was 4 days a month initially with Central Asia Metals, and then that sort of grew into a longer period of time. And ultimately, after about 5 or 6 months, they offered me a full-time role. And oddly enough, I was actually interviewing for a couple of banking roles at the time. And that's really, I guess, where the big decision was made. Is like, do I go back into banking or do I go corporate? And I think at the time, the whole environment around banking was changing in terms of, you know, who was able to make the big decisions, who was able to originate the kinds of deals that I'd like to be doing. And it was getting harder and harder for the bankers, and, you know, more and more regulatory and compliance, time spent on regulatory and compliance issues rather than actually going out and speaking to people and shaking trees and getting deals. And it just became a more attractive environment to be back in corporate, ultimately, for me, which I've really enjoyed the move, I have to say. And I think one thing that I think a lot of bankers and consultants don't appreciate is just how hard it is running a mining company. Now, I'm fortunate, and I run a part-run a company with Nigel as the CEO that is fairly well set up. We've got 2 low-cost operations. We've got steady production. Yes, you know, we're a mining company, we have issues, but in terms of all the mining companies I could have ended up with, it's probably been an easy transition, frankly.
Okay. I wonder if you can give us an overview of those 2 operations, obviously, and the company, but overview of the 2 operations.
Sure. So you mentioned the Kounrad copper facility in Kazakhstan. Now that is pretty unique. It's a dump retreatment processing project. So what we're doing there is processing old Soviet era dumps that were formed around the exploitation of the Kounrad mine. That mine ran from around 1938, I think it was, to about 1995, and has sporadically operated ever since then. And what they did throughout that process was dump about 650 million tons of waste on surface. Now, it's a porphyry deposit, so the geologists amongst your listeners will understand that there's no immediate kind of boundary to a porphyry system. It just sort of bleeds out over space horizontally. So what we've ended up with on surface is just the below cutoff grade stuff that the miners didn't fancy putting through the processing plant at the time. And what we've also got is a lot of oxide material that was mined in the early part of that mine's life that the technology didn't exist to process. So what we now call the eastern dumps is primarily oxide material that's been placed on surface, and the western dumps is primarily what used to be sulfide material, but has been on surface for so long that it has started to weather into secondary sulfides and various other things. So we can still exploit it by leaching with very dilute sulfuric acid, which we put onto the dumps. And then we collect the pregnant leach solution and pump that to a plant. So what makes it unique is that there's no mining, no crushing, and no sort of pre-processing of the material before it goes into the plant facility to produce copper metal, ultimately. The first thing that struck me when I visited the mine was how quiet it was, because the only thing you can hear, rather than big trucks and crushing equipment and, you know, huge heavy machinery going the whole time, was just the whirring of electric pumps, because and you're just pumping, you know, 1,000 cubic meters of solution around every day. So the guys that built that were really Nick Clark, who I mentioned earlier, a chap called Howard Nicholson, and then Nigel Robinson, who's the current CEO. It was effectively that team of 3 that pulled that whole thing together in terms of the technicals and the financing of it. And it was that project that Central Asia Metals used as a basis for its IPO back in 2010. We raised $60 million to build that project, brought it in on time and under budget, and we're producing copper in April 2012 when the price was around $8,000 a ton. And the other thing, because we're not doing mining, and because electricity costs in Kazakhstan are very low and labor costs are competitive, we produce copper there at 51 cents a pound. So it's a very low cost operation, highly profitable. And as a platform to build a company off, it's been fantastic because of the high cash flow and the long life. We've got a life out to 2034 on that project. And as I said, it started in 2012. It's been a good opportunity for me to come in as business development director, and that was the role I joined as in 2014, because you were under no pressure to do a deal where, you know, if you get towards the end of life, and I think too many miners do this, they enjoy the good days and then all of a sudden wake up and they've got 5 years left of their core asset. And to do a deal within that 5-year period, it does put pressure on. So myself and Nigel feel under no enormous pressure to do deals. We did the Sasa deal just over 3 years ago, 2017, we closed that. What attracted us there was the low cost as well, which allowed us to continue with our capital sort of allocation program, which we can talk about if you like, Rob. And so the Kounrad asset, you know, produces around 13,500 tons of copper every year at low cost, you know, and we expect that sort of run rate to continue for the next few years at least. So it's a great one. Yeah.
You mentioned obviously the allocation program. Just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's I guess getting back to 2012 when the guys started producing, what we realized is that the equity markets were starting to treat mining slightly differently. Whereas before, if you went out and you discovered something, clearly there was a big re-rate in your share price. And then you'd see through that development cycle, there's that famous graph that everybody shows that looks like a sort of snake. And through that development cycle, it would go up and you'd hit engineering milestones and you'd re-rate on all of those. You'd complete a pre-feas and a feasibility study, and then you'd finance the thing. And then while you were constructing it, the share price would always come down because people just saw risk, and then you'd start producing and it'd go up again. And probably around 10 years ago, equity investors started demanding something different. They were like, okay, well, we all like the upside and the commodity price exposure and all those sort of things, but we also want some money back. And I think we started seeing the large caps definitely changing, you know, fixing their balance sheets post the financial crisis, disposing of unprofitable assets or higher cost assets, paying down debt and reinstating big dividend programs. And those things have remained in place for the last decade. On the junior end of the spectrum, there was not a lot of that going on. And where Nick and Nigel and the board saw an opportunity was to become a junior mining company that paid a healthy dividend. And because of the low cost base at Kounrad, what they were able to do is put a pretty unique dividend policy in place where they paid out 20% of gross revenue, which is, I've never seen a dividend policy like that anywhere else.
Yeah.
And which gave investors a real sort of kicker on their returns, but also almost double the leverage to the copper price, if you see what I mean. So you had the capital appreciation of the share price levered to the copper price, but also then the payout was directly related to the copper price as well. And that was in place for 5 years, that program. And we only changed it when we bought Sasa because we were becoming a little bit more of a grown-up company. We had then multi-commodities and introduced, I suppose you could say, another element of risk into the business by becoming an underground miner, which we didn't have previously. So we rejigged the policy to pay out 30 to 50% of free cash flow. And that free cash flow is defined as cash from operations less capital expenditure. And then we also take into account debt repayments as well. But the 30 to 50% is effectively free cash less CapEx. And that allows us at least some flexibility to move that payout in response to how the commodity cycle is going, how our other sort of demands on capital are. And so far, it's been able to maintain a good yield of between 6 and 7% as well, which was pretty much what we were on previously. So it's a good policy. I think it's fairly clear to understand. If people want to look it up, it's explicitly stated within our financial statements, both at interim and final year. So it's a pretty easy calculation to make.
Okay. Just going back to obviously the two operations, what's the sort of major differences in jurisdictions with obviously Kazakhstan and Macedonia? Is there any major differences working in either of those two jurisdictions?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously there is, but does it
And I
bother us?
suppose that,
Probably
yeah,
not. No.
I suppose anything that's pretty glaring.
No, they've got different tax regimes for a start. I mean, start from the CFO perspective. So, but both are competitive. So in Kazakhstan, we pay corporate income tax at a rate of 20%, and then we pay a royalty, which is called mineral extraction tax, of 5.7%. Whereas in North Macedonia, the tax rate is 10% and the royalty rate is 2%. So both, as I said, very favorable fiscal regimes. Kazakhstan, I would say, is much more familiar with the natural resources industry because it's an economy that's effectively founded on it. They're a big oil and gas producer, and you'll know that companies like Kaz Minerals, ENRC, as it was called in the day, you know, these are all big producers of commodities. So just about, with a couple of exceptions, I mean, most major companies have had a look at Kazakhstan. So Glencore is a big operator there. Rio Tinto has pegged a lot of ground there and has a team out there exploring for copper. Kaz Minerals, we all know very well, very successful story coming out of Kazakhstan. And then you've got all the US oil majors in there, plus KMG, Kazmunai Gas, which is, you know, a huge local oil and gas producer. So as a natural resources economy, they're very familiar with it, right? And I think operating there, therefore, you've got pretty well-established legislation around the minerals laws, and they have opened up a little bit, and they've had a more sort of Western approach to issuing of licenses, which is great. So it's a lot of positive reforms that have gone through Kazakhstan, whereas before you'd be subject to a government tender process. Now you can actually go onto an online cadastral system, see a piece of land that you like. If it's available, you can peg it and go and explore. So I think from that perspective, it's fairly well set up. Whereas North Macedonia, whilst it has a few operating mines, with the political situation there and the government changing, I think it was back in 2017, the new government is really sort of settling into how it deals with the natural resources industry. And so we spend a lot of time, and we've spent good time with government officials and also department officials, just familiarizing them with what we do, how we do it, the fact that we behave responsibly in terms of our environmental performance, in our social engagement, and paying our taxes and being very transparent about our finances. And that's all won a lot of goodwill over the last 3 years, I have to say, Rob, because unfortunately we had an incident with our tailings facility in September last year. And the way we dealt with that was, just through real transparency with the locals and also with our own shareholders. And in effect, we ended up getting a lot of support out of the local communities and the government in order to help us rectify these things and keep the operation going while we were doing it. So I think from that perspective, North Macedonia is definitely coming up the curve. And I think there are a couple of big mine developments that hopefully they can get their heads around in the next few years. And we'll see an industry there that'll grow into something that's beneficial for the whole nation.
Yeah. Okay. I want to slowly wrap this up. So as a sort of conclusion, I spoke with Nick Clark, which was one of my first episodes. So if anyone's listening wants to see how things have developed from obviously doing this episode to when I interviewed Nick probably nearly 2 years ago. I just wondered if you can give us an update on the company and obviously your projects and how things are moving forward, and what's the sort of future over the, I suppose, short to medium term.
Sure. Well, Nick himself has moved from, I think 2 years ago, he probably was chairman, wasn't he? So Nick was effectively one of the founders of CAML in its current form. He was brought in about 3 years after the company was formed, but really sort of focused the strategy on the Kounrad operation. And he's now moved to a non-exec chairman role, but is still very passionate and involved, which is good because his level of experience and knowledge is second to none, really. I think the major change that we've made since you spoke to Nick really is some optimization work that we've done at Sasa in North Macedonia. We've a lot of little tweaks to that operation that have improved it. And now we, very proud of the fact that we've had, a sort of LTI free, I think we're at 700 days at Kounrad, and, I might have those numbers wrong, but, huge improvement in the health and safety regime there as well. But also, as I said earlier, in terms of capital allocation, we're going to be spending some money at Sasa over the next 2 years to transition from a sublevel cave mining method to a cut and fill mining method, which does two things. It improves the health and safety and also improves the extraction of the ore body and ensures the longevity of that project. The really good side effect of that is also that we can then place about 40% of our tailings underground, which, tailings being a hot topic in the mining industry, is a good thing. The fewer sort of tons of tailings you're putting on surface these days, the better. So that's going to, the outlook for the next 2 years is partly focusing on rolling out that program, and by the end of 2022, transitioning into that new mining method. Kounrad, it's pretty set fare, really. I think that operation will continue, as I said, to 2034, producing, we're guiding 12.5 to 13,500 tons of copper. It's a neat little operation. We don't see any necessary kind of capital investment there other than sustaining capital over the next few years. We may be looking at some facilities to facilitate a little more green energy usage, but those are sort of ideas that we're mulling at the moment. And in terms of the business itself, the outlook is really around growth through M&A. And I think we've got myself and Nigel and a lady called Louise Rathel, the three of us, focusing a fair amount of our time on the sort of inorganic growth aspects of the business now.
Okay. And I was just going to ask you from a finance perspective, obviously, as you're the CFO, in terms of obviously cash flows, investments, and obviously you mentioned M&A. Is there anything in particular you're focusing on? Is there focusing on a particular commodity, particular jurisdiction?
Well, look, in terms of finances, we've got a really good balance sheet. I think we started the year of net debt of just under $40 million. We're repaying our current debt facility at a rate of $3.2 million a month. So every repayment we make gives us a little bit more ability to go out and do something. And I think with the sort of balance sheet in great shape, we do have the ability to go and purchase something transformational. Now, clearly we'd love to do that because we think scale is important these days in the mining industry. But there's a limited number of opportunities out there. And I think, it's going to take patience, and what we need to ensure at every step is making sure that whatever we do is accretive for our own shareholders. So we're not just going to go for scale's sake, and we're not going to buy anything that's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on the balance sheet, I think is the two things. Now, in terms of metals, clearly copper remains a focus. We are active in the three base metals. We think that all three of those metals have a decent outlook over the next, the foreseeable future at least. Of the three, I'd probably say copper is the most attractive in terms of future outlook and its involvement with the electric vehicle thesis. But I think in terms of what we're looking for, the objective is really to get to a point where we are producing from a diverse number of assets at a rate of around 100,000 tons of copper a year, and potentially, using that as a platform to grow even further. So,
okay, Gavin, really appreciate your time, and give us an overview of your career. Like I said, coming from geology, moving into a CFO role, and give us an update on Central Asia Metals. So I really appreciate your time in providing obviously the content around that. If our audience wants to reach out to you and may have some questions around that type of a career path from geology going into a CFO role, or want to know more a little bit about Central Asia Metals, how can they go about doing that?
Well, the best thing to do is speak to, people are more welcome to drop me an email. I think my email address is probably on a few press releases somewhere. But yeah, myself and Louise, very happy to speak to people about the business. primarily. If people want to know more about Central Asian metals, then Louise is really the prime contact, and her details are on our website. I'm very happy to field questions and calls from people as well. And if anybody wants to contact me on their careers, various other things, LinkedIn is a good way to go. Just mention that you saw me here.
Yeah, no, and I do get people coming to me and asking questions, and also I get some of our listeners actually approach me after listening to episodes. For instance, may listen to this and may have some questions because that's what they're thinking. They may be thinking they're going down that path. So hopefully they will connect with you and may have some questions around that, and you're helping someone who may have that mindset that they want to go down that career path, but really at a stumbling block. So yeah, appreciate you if you could provide any advice if someone does reach out to them.
If we can help, we will. But I'd encourage people to, back themselves if they want to do that career change, which I did a kind of half career change where I went from one aspect of the mining industry into another. But I know people have done the full change from something to another thing, and I think it's just a case of backing your own abilities, really.
Yeah,
and I suppose if I can facilitate that for anybody, or via a chat or whatever else, and very happy to do so.
Yeah, and I suppose also what they're passionate about. So they may have gone into geology or engineering or even metallurgy and just feel like, do you know what, I want to do something a little bit different. It's not necessarily what I expected, but I'm technical, I like numbers, and then they can move in that path. So yeah, appreciate you. Appreciate your update and giving us your view around that. So hope you enjoyed listening to the podcast. I certainly did, and again, appreciate if you can pass this episode on to others that may be interested in this, and appreciate your continued support. So until next time, happy mining.